Okay, we are on Tov Beis Amud Aleph, the very bottom line, the last words of the previous to the bottom line, Toshma. Remember that our discussion here continues in the machlokes between Abaya and Rava on Yiur Shalom Midas, which we hope to conclude actually today. But Yiur Shalom Midas, meaning that can you have yish? Can you have someone making something hefker or giving up without knowing that it's lost, without knowing that he's no longer in control? Meaning something happens while he's sleeping or while he's up and just doesn't know. So the machlokes here is Abaya takes a more stringent position and says, no, you can never have yish shalom midas, only when someone knows that it's no longer available to him. Can he be miyayish? Can he say, I give up? And Rava says, no, we can impute yish. So the last Gemara, last daf and a half from the Gemara is various cases to prove one or the other. And in each case, we distinguish that case and say you can't prove from here because that case has some significant differences that don't allow you to extrapolate a general rule. So that's how the Gemara has been going back and forth. And this is where we are now. We're going to touch on something very interesting, a very interesting subject. So this is the Toshma. Toshma, Odo HaTalalein. So let's understand what the Gemara is going to tell us here. There is in Vayikra, in Parsha Shemini, there's a pasuk in Perikid Aleph, pasuk Lamed Dalid, for those who want to take a quick look, where the Torah tells us how is something become tameh. It just doesn't happen. There has to be some events that trigger an item to become tameh. With regard to food, anything that's connected to the ground can never become tameh. It means a tree is growing, fruit is growing, grain is growing. No tumah can be chal. Number one, it has to be separated from the ground, means that the fruit has to be harvested or fall off, or the grain has to be cut. That's the only way, step one, that it can become tumah. The second important element is that item, once it's separated from the ground, has to become wet. Once it becomes wet, that's called mukhshar lekabel tumah. Now it is receptive of becoming tameh. So if rain falls on a tree and the fruit on the tree, no problem, no tumah. You have a bunch of peaches that fall from the tree. It's the hot, dry summer, no tumah. There is a dew or rain or whatever moist falls on the fruit. Now it's mukhshar lekabel tumah. What does that mean? So the Torah there in Vayikra goes on to say that there are 8 different classes of shrotzim, of animals, if you will, or birds, or different kinds of animals, shrotzim meaning insects, that if they land on the food, it becomes tameh. So it's a combination of the food has to be separated and wet, can be dry now, but it was once wet, and the animal. Okay, so that's the whole subject of tumah in a nutshell that we're going to need to understand from our Gemara here what's going on. So now, with that in mind, let's take a look. Toshma, Gemara says as follows. Odera talalein. You have the prerequisites of a fruit that was cut off from the ground or grain or whatever it happens to be, and the dew was on it. The dew was on it. Dew comes, by the way, by itself. No one pours dew on the ground. So already we begin, at least now at this point, we're beginning to see that you don't have to wet it. It can be wet of its own or from another source. And he's pleased. He's happy that it's wet. In other words, he wants it to be wet, right? Rashi says, Somach betal shiur aleim. In other words, so the example that Rashi says that Gemara is talking about, if someone takes the fruit up on his roof, which was very common in those days, they put it out in the sun. Maybe the sun would ripen it a little bit better, and then the dew, which naturally falls in the morning, is on it, and he's happy about it. then harizeh b'chiyutan. That is in the category of b'chiyutan, and it's muksher lekabel tumah. Now, what is b'chiyutan? So let's understand that there is a pasuk in the Torah that, and again, right after this pasuk that we read about tumah in pasuk lamed ches, it says as follows: "V'chiyipol menivlosam al kol zera zareya sheyizara taru v'chiyutan mayim al zera." If you put water on a seed, v'nofel menivlosam alav, tomehu lochem. So, in the Gemara parlance, we use this term v'chiyutan to express that something is muksher l'kabel tumah. It's the category of v'chiyutan. That's the term that's used, meaning.
Rabbi Grauman, you muted. Rabbi Grauman, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Okay. So, all right. So b'chiyutan means that it's in the category of being muksher l'kabel tumah. So that's what the Gemara says. B'chiyutan. Now, what happens nagvo if it dries up? It's no longer wet from the dew. It's dried up. Afal pishes samach ena b'chiyutan means as follows: if he first becomes aware of the food that is now muksher l'kabel tumah, but he becomes aware not while it's wet, but it already dried up, meaning, oh wow, the food, the peaches are on the ground, but they're dry. Oh, wait a minute, there was a dew this morning. Oh, that's right, there was a dew this morning. I'm good with it. Says the Gemara, eina b'chiyutan. That's not in the category of b'chiyutan, and it can't become tameh. Look at the Rashi on the very top. Eina b'chiyutan. V'lo omrinan. We don't say given the hashta nicham mahane hodata l'mikara. We don't impute to say that now that he's happy, he was happy earlier too when he didn't know it was wet. This is a very, very clear question to Rava. Rava says that we impute knowledge even when someone doesn't know. If that's the case, then why is it not b'chiyutan? It was wet in the morning. Now it's not wet, and when he finds out, he sees it's dry. But it was wet, and if we impute his knowledge that he would be happy, why is it not muksher l'kabel tumah? So l'chara, this is a kasha on Rava. It's clear from this instance that we don't hold like Rava, because according to Rava, in this particular situation, b'chiyutan should apply retroactively to when it was wet, even if he didn't know it. So
question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, what about if he's not happy? I mean, what about if he's, his worker's up on the roof and carrying a bucket of water and trips and spills it all over his fruit, and he's like, "What did you do? I didn't want to get wet. You're going to mess it up." He's not happy. Is it still Helsher?
Well, so the basic assumption here is that when a person has fruit that he has cut off, he wants moisture because he wants the fruit to continue being soft and proper. In other words, if he has a fruit and all of a sudden there's a dry wave and there's no rain, that's not good. That's not good for the fruit. That's not good for any of the produce. So the natural dew and water, not overdue, but natural towel certainly is God's gift to the produce. That's the way produce continues to stay fresh and all of those things. So if he's a farmer or if he just has his own produce that he's grown, that's something he naturally wants. In other words, he's waiting with bated breath. When is it going to get moist? When is it going to get wet? When am I going to be able to sort of move on? So the simcha is assumed. The question here in the Gemara is, when does the simcha happen? Well, it happens when there's moisture. So if he sees the moisture, he's happy. Okay, that completes the whole cycle of preparatory of hechsher l'kabel tumah, and it's l'kabel tumah. But if he comes along and sees it's dry, then that's not so good. But wait a minute, I know that this fruit was sitting on my roof already from last night, and clearly the dew came this morning, but the sun shone and now dried it up. So I should be happy. I'm happy. Why not? Says the Gemara. No, you can't impute b'chiyutan. Why? Says that. So the Gemara says, "My love, mishum delol omrinan." We don't say kividi goli milza the hashta nichale mikara namelichale. We don't say like Rava that since now he's happy, he was happy before when he didn't know it. So l'chayra, this is a very clear-cut case against Rava. So the Gemara wants to bring a raya from here. This is he says the proof that we don't hold like Rava. Says the Gemara, not so fast. No. In other words, what we've been doing till now is every case where we have a raya, we right away distinguish and say it's no raya. So what does the Gemara say here? No. Shani Hosam Dechsiv Ki Yitain Achi Yitain. All right, so now let's take a look at the words in the Torah, which are very interesting. The Torah says V'chi Yutan, but the letters of the word are Yud, Taf, Nun. Without Nakudos, if you were a Balkore, and let's say you didn't, and you're not a Balkore, so you open up and you look at it and say, oh, V'chi Yitain. Yud, Taf, Nun is Yitain. It's a Greek sieve. It says Yud, Taf, Nun, which you and I would say is Yitain, but it's spelled Yutan. The real Yutan is Yud, Vav, Taf, Nun. This is what we call a choser. It's missing the Vav. So now the Gemara wants to extrapolate and say, wait a minute. It didn't say Yutan. It's the words are Yutofnan, Tufnun, which is Yitain. So this is how we're going to learn it. In other words, the Gemara now is going to distinguish because of the way it's written, not to be a raya against Rava. How? Ki Yitain, Achi Yitain. No, Tuma only happens when you put the water on. In other words, you, like Nasha said before, you got to take your little bucket and you got to pour water all over the fruit or over the grain. Pshat is you have to do a maisa, de jure. You have to get up, do a maisa, get it wet, and then it's mukshal kabel tuma. None of this automatic water like dew. So the chara at this point in the Gemara, if it says chiyitain, dew wouldn't be good enough. You have to have a physical act. Like the Gemara Ihacha Reisha Nami, we just got through saying that if he came in the morning and he saw the dew and he saw that it was wet, then he's misameach and it's mukshal kabel tuma. You're telling me because it says chiyitain that you have to do an act. How can the Reisha say that dew is good? In other words, it's inherently a kasha on actually the Gemara. You want to say b'chiyitain that it really means it has to be yitain, not yutan. Then how is the Reisha okay? The Reisha says you don't have to physically do it yourself. Do is good. It's an obvious question, of course, and it begs the answer. It's the answer that we want. And for the Gemara, no. Hosam can Rav Papa. You know what the pshat is? It's the way Rav Papa learned it. Rav Papa Rami ksiv ki yitain b'charinin ki yutan v'ketzad. Rav Papa asked the question. It says in the Torah, Yud Tov Nun is ki yitain. We call it yutan. What is that all about? So now Rav Papa is asking the basic question: why do you have this Greek sieve? What are you enhancing to our knowledge by taking the word yitain and making it yutan? So now comes Rav Papa and he says, Be'inan, we need it. Why? Ki yutan dumya de chiyitain. The chiyutan, the automatic, has to be like the one that you do yourself. What's pshat? Ma yitin ladas, af ki yutan nami ladas. Says the Gemara, you know what? This is how we're going to explain it according to Rav Papa. That really it says yitain in the kri, in the ksiv rather, but we pronounce it yutan. What's the chiddush? That yutan and has to be like yitain, meaning when you take a bucket and you pour it down, you know what you're doing. You're taking a bucket, you're pouring it over the fruit, you're making it wet. So you know instantly the food is wet. The pshat is that yutan is also good when when you know it's wet. In other words, when dew falls down, you know it's wet, then it's mukshal kabel tuma. And what the Gemara is saying is here is that even Rava admits, Rava who says that you can impute das, you can impute knowledge, and therefore yish shaloi midas have a yish. Rava will admit that in our case, because of the posuk of ki yitain, and we say yutan, that it's not like every other case. So Rava really holds yish shaloi midas have a yish. No kasha on Rava. From here we see it's a kasha. Teretz is it's no kasha because here we have a beferish pasuk in the Torah that tells us the only time it becomes tamei is when v'chiyutan is like v'chiyitein. What is v'chiyitein? I know what I'm doing. I know it's wet. I just poured water over it. So chuyutan has to be like that too, meaning when the dew falls down, you have to know the dew is falling down. And if you came and it's already dry and everybody says, oh, there was a wonderful dew this morning, no dice. It doesn't work because it's not like the chiyite. So that's how the Gemara wants to answer this kasha and say that there's no raya against Rava because this is a distinct pasuk in the Torah. Now Rashi says kosav kiyite velo ksiv kiyutan. It doesn't say kiyutan with a vav, right? It's just with a without a vav. So we said ladas sheyoda benesina v'huksha be'eno v'oda hatala leim adayin hein benisonu. So in other words, at this point in time, the Gemara says it has to be ladas. So the only time is when it's with knowledge. How is it with knowledge? Because you see it's wet. So the Gemara answers it's no kasha on Rava because the whole incident of Tuma is not comparable to Yish. Okay, that's another distinction.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
So if I understand this correctly, I go ahead and I cut a whole field of grain and I let them, maybe I gathered it up in bushel or whatever, but it's sitting out. And I go home, it's too late. The workers want to go home, so we don't bother to take stuff inside or put it on the roof or whatever, sitting there. Now I go inside and I the whole night, the whole morning I'm inside. I davened at home. I didn't look out the window once. I come out in the morning after the dew has come, the dew has dried up. Presumably there was dew and it came and it dried up. Would I then now be able to literally take this grain that even though it's been sitting out and I go out and I find a dead sheretz on a pile? Okay. Is it literally then not tame because I didn't see the dew?
Correct.
So now when it comes, because that could be when it comes to which part of it can I give to the Kohen, right? Because it's got to be not tame, right? Right. So now it's gonna matter. Whereas if I had gotten up in the morning and looked out the window and seen the dew drops on the grain, then I would have to assume that then if I then came out later and saw dead sheretz on it, that pile is now tame.
Right. So again, you're 100% right. So if he comes out and sees the sheretz and he says, you know something, I think there probably was dew. There's dew every morning, but I didn't see it. So al pi halacha, it's not tame. Now he may use his judgment and say, I'm going to give from the kohen from what I don't see a sheretz on. Although who says there wasn't a sheretz?
Well, no. The whole problem with the sheretz is a dead sheretz, right? So
right, but maybe
if it's not there, presumably,
presumably, right. In other words, we're not making assumptions and saying that because the sheretz is in one place that it wasn't another place too. You're right. We don't say that. So because he sees the sheretz, according to this Gemara, it's not tame. He may again better part of judgment and say, you know what? I have no idea. The halacha is. Even Rava admits that it's not tame, but I'll still give him from something else. But you're right. You can't assume. This pasuk tells us that you can't make an assumption that there was dew, even though 364 days a year there's dew. And why shouldn't it be on this day too? But because you didn't see it, and we need kiyitain, chiyutan, dumya, we don't have it. And Rava would say too, you know why? This is not like Yish Shaloi Midas. Yish Shaloi Midas, for sure. I would have agreed. But this is not Yishla Midas. This is V'chiyiten. Torah tells us you have to know. How do you know? Because you see it. So if you pour it, you know. If you don't pour it, the only way you know is if it's wet. If it's not wet, you don't know. So that's the teretz. So that's the teretz here that the Gemara says. So there's no okay. Now we come to the next case, which is a whole different set of inyanim. And here I think we're going to come to a definitive conclusion on this parsha, this sugya. Toshima. Come and listen to the following case. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shmuel ben Yehutzada. So this Amira says, Minayin la'aveda sheshot v'nor shu m'teres. Remember, in the previous daf, we said that if the rivers overflow the banks and takes everything from the banks and washes it away, then an owner has no hope of recovery, and he's miyayish. Because when again, you look in Europe today, the flooding, no one in his right mind would say, I'm going to get my whatever, my little flower pot, whatever he lost, because it's long gone, because the floods have taken everything away. So, and that makes sense. There's a certain sefer to that. So the Gemara says, Menayin, how do you know? No, so he says, wait a minute, there's a Beferish Pasuk. What's the Beferish Pasuk? The Pasuk tells us by Hashavas HaVeda, right? There's a Pasuk here. We're going to take a look at the Pasuk just so we can see it. By Hashavas HaVeda, I think it's in Devarim. Hold on. So the Torah tells us, if you don't see the ox of your friend and he got lost, he doesn't see it. And then the Gemara extrapolates, v'chein tasa l'chamoro, v'chein tasa l'simosa, v'chein tasa l'chol avedas achicha, asher toivad, anything that's lost from your friend, mimenu. Now this is very important. The pasuk says everything that is lost from him, mimenu umutsasa, and you find it. Lo tuchal hisalim, you can't hide. In other words, you have to give it back. So this is the mitzvah of Hashavas HaVeda, that if something comes into your hand and it was lost to your friend, you have to return it. Again, this is the very open statement. We have to get into the weeds to understand what happened in this particular case. But that's the general rule for Hashavas HaVeda. Says, so the Gemara says, v'chein tasa l'chamoro, v'chein tasa l'simlaso, and tal l'chol avedas achicha asher tovad mimenu u'motzasa. So the chayra, so the kasha is, what's pshat mimenu? Without mimenu, Rashi says, without mimenu, we would know the same thing. Why do we have to have the word mimenu? It says, so you can't hide, as if you didn't see it. So why does it have to say mimenu, from him? So here the Gemara uses this word, as it always does, and said the word mimenu seems to be unnecessary, because you can simply say which he lost. Why mimenu, from him? So it says the Gemara, mi she'avoda himenu mitzia esel kol adam, that the word mimenu specifically refers, when you have to return it, when it is lost to him, but not to everybody else. But yotzasa, to exclude zusha avoda mimenu ve'enu mitzuya etzel kadam. The category of lost to him and lost to everybody else is a separate category. So what do we have here? We have a situation where Reuven lost an item, but Reuven lost it. Okay, Shimon found it. Shabbos Haveda. You have a mitzvah of Shabbos Haveda. Assuming you know it's Reuven's. We're making that assumption. What happens in the case of Shotfa Nohar, where the rivers overflowed and it was taken down all the way downstream, and you found it in West Virginia? Then it's no longer Motzasa. Someone found it, but it's not even shayach to say that the person who lost it would have a havamina that it would come back. So again, we're making a distinction of mitzasa. So the Torah tells us that if Reuven loses it and Shimon finds it because he dropped it, he was walking to shul on Arkola and he dropped it, and Menashe came along from Lamberton and they saw it, no problem. But what happens in a situation where Reuven lost it and realistically there is no one else who would find it? LaMarshall, the rains take it away, right? You look at the pictures, I saw the pictures from Turkey. I said, my goodness, I mean, houses were floating away, trucks. So there's no havamina that it's going to be found. Then there's no matzasa. And by the way, so the Mefarshim explained that the pasuk in the Torah is telling us that Hashavas Aveda is only when umatzasa you can find it. If you can't find it, even though someone will find it somewhere 5 miles away, that's not considered found. In other words, it has to be more or less in where you are. He dropped it, you found it. Okay, a block away, half a block away. But if what's imputed is that if it's not where in the environment where someone would normally find it, you can't find it. Okay, so the Gemara asked the Kasha, how do you know it? So you said we learned it from a Shabbos Aveda. That only something that can be found, but something that can't be found, LaMarshall, the river takes it away. So now we understand why we have to have the word mimenu, because the word mimenu restricts it that only something that can be found you have to return to him, something that normally can't be found, even though it will be found somewhere by someone, but it's not in the realm of the normalcy, then you don't have that. There's no mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda, and therefore you don't have to return it. Well, says the Gemara Vayter. Now, what are we talking about? Are we talking about something that has a siman, not a siman? We haven't addressed that yet. Says the Gemara, and this is the big chiddush, the isura dumya dehetera, that something which is forbidden, meaning that you would not normally be able to keep it, you'd have to give it back. Dumya dehetera is comparable to something that is heter, and you don't have to give it back. We're talking about the finder. It's also to the finder to keep it because it's a Shabbos Aveda, or it's mutter to the finder to keep because there's no Shabbos Aveda. What does that mean? My hetera, bein de ispe simin, bein de lesme simin. If the rivers overflow, and I have a favorite keychain, and that keychain has my initials and has all kinds of marking on it, and I would know it from everything, right? Means it has a siman. That's a siman. What happens if the rivers flood it and my poor keychain finds its way down the river all the way in the Potomac down to Harper's Ferry, right? But someone will pick it up in Harper's Ferry and see this beautiful keychain with initials, with all kinds of unusual things on it. Doesn't have to return it. It has a siman. Teretz is that if it's something that would not normally be in the realm of what you would return, even with a siman, you can keep it. That's the chiddush. So he says, my hetera, bein de ispe siman, bein de lesme siman, shara, it's permitted to keep it. Af isura, something that's osir, meaning I drop it on our cola, and Menashe comes by and he sees it. Bein de ispe siman, bein de lespe siman, asura. Listen to this. It has no siman, but it's osir to keep. So if Menashe found a keychain, plain keychain, looks like the keychain you bought at CVS, 10 people could have bought it. But you find it on the street, and so someone locally lost it. According to this, you have to return it. Now, you don't know who to return it, so that's going to be a problem, but you can't automatically keep it. So now, l'chayra, what's the problem here? According to Abaya, this was never in doubt, because when a person lost his keychain and didn't know it, he's not miyayish. He doesn't know it, he lost it. According to Rava, when a person drops a keychain without a siman, according to Baya, it's never lost with a siman, without a siman, because he doesn't know it. According to Rava, we're saying yish shaloi midas have a yish. Are you kidding me? This keychain has no siman. Why in the world would he not be make it hefker if it doesn't have a siman? Says the Gemara, no. Even in this case, Rava could not say that you impute that it belongs to him, because we just got through saying that we're comparing heter to iser. Just like by heter with a siman, without a siman, the same by iser with a siman, without a siman. So now we have a real question on Rava. How can Rava say in a case of Yiyush that if there's no siman, for sure in his sleep he would have been miyayish? We see beferish from the pasuk that he would not be miyayish because of the comparison of heter and iser. And here we are talking about Yiyush. So there's no distinguishing factor. Before we had a distinguishing factor, the pasuk says tiyuta and tiyita and whatever. Here we're talking about Yiyush, and we see beferish that you can't keep it. So says the Gemara, tiyufta the Rava tiyufta. This is a serious kasha on Rava, and therefore the halacha is like Abaya. So this is the definitive proof. This case, which talks about Yiyush, but talks about this Aveda, and we're talking about heter and iser, that we compare the two, just like heter is heter with a siman, without a siman, so too iser is also with a siman, without a siman. Okay, according to Baya, that's not a problem. But according to Rava, it's a serious problem, because without a siman, you have to impute Yiyush. That's Rava's position. And here the pasuk tells us that we compare iser to heter, and even without a siman, you still have to try to return it to the Bala. Says the Gemara, this is a raya to Yufta Rava, the Rava, it's a kasha on Rava, and we don't hold like it. So let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi will help us here. Mimenu, okay, the Rashi in the top, in the fourth line. Kro Yiseirohi, it's an extra word in the pasuk. La'ashmeinan she'eino avod ela haimenu. That, in other words, there isn't automatic loss, right? Mimenu, from him, there has to be something to drash. And we say the Yisura Dumya de Hetera, Kivan the Mechat Kroya Finan, Mitsuya Eitzel Kol Adam, Sheyachzer. From one pasuk, from this very pasuk, we learn the mitzvah Shabbos Aveda that you have to return it. V'she'ena Mitsuya, and if it's not normally found, Yiskeba, Yiskashu Iksha Lahadadi Zuli Yisura V'Zuli Hetera. That's when we come on to the whole question of Isra and Heter, because we learn from this very pasuk not only a Shabbos Aveda, but when you don't have to return it. So now the Gemara wants to say, if we learn from the same pasuk, then they have to be even in every respect. Ma Hetera she'ena mitzuya, which you can't find because the river washed it away. Lo chilik ben sheyesh bo siman she'ein bo siman. Even my favorite keychain with my initials, everybody in the world would know it, or not in the world, but everybody would know it. But if it finds itself so far away that there's definitely Yiyush that is Miyayish, Afesura, says Rashi, the Mitsuya Eitzel Kol Adam, anybody could find it. Lo chilik bein ein siman, the Chiyoda Miyayish, the Yesh siman, the Chiyoda lo Miyayish. There's no chilik between whether he knows or doesn't know, because everything has to be returned. Now, something won't eventually be returned, but at least you have to try. The Yesh siman asira, ki ein siman nami asira. So now you have a kasha. How do you know? Teretz is, it's a kasha on Rava, that according to Rava, so we paskin like Abaya, we're more stringent, that yish shaloi midas lo have yish. So that's the maskana of the Gemara, and that's how we come out. So now the Gemara here tells us,
Rabbi,
yeah, go ahead.
with modern communications might affect the actual application of the halacha, because in those days something was carried away downstream. You had no idea where it came from. Now you're listening to the news and you hear there was a flood in such and such a place. You may be in a position to advertise back to that area that you found something with a simon, and it might have, because there's certainly a bias in the halacha for returning things when you can. And
that's a very good question. With today's technology, how would that impact on the halacha? You're right. I mean, so if someone lost a pen, a marshal, okay, so maybe miyayish, but to the extent that you're right, that someone lost a diamond brooch, and it was worth thousands of dollars, and in today's modern technology, he might be able to put out a notice that, again, can you imagine if you've seen these floods in Turkey or Germany? Can you imagine, even with today, that someone has a hava, again, I don't know, has a havamina that something he lost, and all of that raging water, that he's going to find it? I mean, so now we use the common man theory. In other words, you're right. If he really wanted to hold out and said, this is too important for me to give up without at least putting rewards and all kinds of things and this and that and the other, then again, this would have to be an individual shaila. But you can imagine that given the pictures that we saw, how someone in his mind would say, I don't even begin to know how I'm going to get that brooch back. It's in another country. Who knows? So it's a good question, because we have the means today to possibly track it, which we didn't then. But I think that what the Torah is telling us, it's the common man theory. In other words, what would the common man say under this particular circumstance? Okay, fine. I know I didn't leave Kemp Mill. I know I walked from my house to Shul, to Shalom. It's got to be somewhere. And by the way, I do that. I'm sure we all do. You retrace your steps. Where did I drop that key? I was only in two places. And you know what? As many times as not, I find the key, because I retrace my steps and I realize I took something out of my pocket and the key went out with it. So all I do is I really try to go back, and there it's sitting in the grass because I took out a handkerchief and the key fell out with the handkerchief. But can you imagine if something like drastic like a flood? I don't know. I mean, I think most of us would say yish.
You're talking about the floods of the century, but Bavel 1,500 years ago, even an ordinary flood would have made it impossible. The halacha was based on the common man.
Correct.
Saying in those days, he had no way of knowing where it came from.
Correct.
He didn't see the news and all. I mean,
Right.
so the communications both ways make a difference.
Right, but take a look at the words from the pasuk. The pasuk says, no. So okay. So Shabbos Aveda says the Gemara. Misha of the Haimenu Mitzua Eitzel Kol Adam. Yotzosa to exclude Zusha Avoda Memena Ve'ena Mitzuya Eitzel Kol Adam. That's the words we have to focus on. What is the exception? If someone else can find it, that's a Shabbos Aveda. Where do you draw the line when someone else can find it? Says the Gemara, Ve'ena Mitzuya Eitzel Kol Adam. It's not likely that anybody will find it, i.e., now, can you imagine you're flying in a helicopter, or you have one of those parasails. You're parasailing along, and then you have something in your pocket, and it falls into the ocean, and you're parasailing, and you go another mile. Do you have a havamina? Do you have a havamina that you're going to find that? No. So now, you could always say, well, the shore might kick it up. Okay, with technology, I'm going to advertise. I know it's somewhere in this greater region. It's not in Argentina. It's here. I'm here. I'm in Bethany. It's got to be in Bethany. I'm at the beach. Teretz is that we use a common man theory of what the common man would think is normal or not. But you're right. it at least begs the question. At some point in time, it was never a question. Today, and as we have more and more technology, now I'll give you an example. At the beach, and I think I used this example once, at the beach, people lose all kinds of things in the sand. You know, you have these people at the end of the day, they have these metal detectors. They're finding all this stuff.
Beachcombers.
Beachcombers. So if I'm of a mind and I lost a bracelet and the bracelet was expensive and I had one of these gadgets, look, if the water took it, I don't stand a chance, but let me at least wait. And when people leave, I'll take my gadget, I'll go all over the sand, and maybe I'll be lucky and it buried itself in the sand and didn't get washed out to sea. Again, didn't have that in the time of the Gemara. They didn't even dream there was such a thing. So the teretz is, you're right, the halacha is adaptable, and we have to look at the halacha today. What is now considered in this exclusion that you can't find? Maybe it's less than you think. Maybe there's a bigger circle of things you can find than at the time of the Gemara. But again, some of the examples we're talking about are clearly examples where you can't find it. And you have no choice but to be miyayish. But in any event, this underlying question is what undoes Rava's theory, and the halacha is like Abaye. Now, very interesting. Again, if you've learned Daf Yomi or other places in Shas, this is one of the most famous acronyms. We live in a town with acronyms, so we know every acronym almost that exists. One acronym that Washington doesn't know is the acronym of Yal Kigam. And this is a famous acronym in the Gemara. What does it mean? The Hilchasa Kavasa the Abaya Biyal Kigam, says the Gemara. So after slugging up Rava, the Gemara says, you know how you know in the machlekes between Abaya and Rava? Now, Abaya is usually the one who's more stringent. He's the one who's more machmir. How do you know, like in Hillel and Shammai, I don't know that there is an acronym. I don't remember, but maybe there is. But with Abaya and Rava, there's a clear acronym, and the acronym is Yal Kigam. What is Yal Kigam? Yud Ayin Lamed Kuf Gimel Mem. Says Rashi, Yal Kigam, Simone halachas hein, these are Simone halachas to Abaya. Hein yir shalom midas dahacha. Okay, the very first one is Yud. Yud is yir shalom midas. That's exactly what we're learning. So from Yal Kigam, if we had said Yal Kigam before we started learning this whole Gemara, we would have known the outcome before we learned the Gemara, because we would have known that in Yir Shalom Midas, the halach is like Abaya, not like Rava. So now he's going to go to this Rashi. Interestingly, just to understand what he's talking about, he's going to give us the other examples of Yal Kigam. And the next one that he brings down is Eid Zomim, L'Mafreya Hu Nifsel. The Gemara in Sanhedrin talks about Eid Zomim, whether, in other words, once you discover someone is an Eid Zomim, is it prospective or retroactive? So, you know, there's this great debate when you uncover evidence and you find something that was improper, do you uncover it so that now you have to dig out all the old cases where this evidence might have relevance, and thereby you will have to reverse what could be many cases because you now have evidence? Or do we say this evidence is prospective? So an Eid Zomim, what's an Eid Zomim? An Eid Zomim, he falsifies the testimony. Can you impute that he falsified testimony? And an Eid Zomim is postulators. So do we say he's postulators retroactively, and this guy was a professional witness in dozens of cases? According to Abaya, yes. According to Rava, no. So according to Abaya, we paskin like Abaya that an Eid Zomim, we have to undo his testimony in previous cases. So if he testified and the decision was based on his testimony, and it could be that he testified and there was other evidence. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where the entire testimony of the case was based on this fellow, and he's now an Eid Zomim. Abaya says in Sanhedrin, no dice. You can't count him. That's an immense burden. that now you're going to have to go back to these cases and figure out whether or not you have other testimony other than this aid zone. So that's pshat. That's the second one. Ayin Lamed. He said Lamed is lechia omid me'elav. So for our Menashem and other people who do the Eruv regularly, so you know that you have to have a lechi in order to have an Eruv. So if you come along, and there it is, a natural lechi. You have a lechi that's just standing there. There's more an Eruvin. So the question is, if you have a mavui that is behind the lechi, can you now carry? Because you didn't do anything. I mean, the lechi was just standing there. So again, machlok is between Abai and Rava. Abai is more machmir, and Rava is not. Okay, that's the lamed. Kuf. What is kuf? Says the Gemara. Kedushin shel nimsru lebiyah. This is a very interesting case. The Gemara says that in order to have a marriage, you have to have what we know as kikachish isha. In other words, you have to take your wife, you have to engage her, and you have to take her, uvulo, and you have to cohabit with her. So the completion of marriage is cohabitation, is living together. What happens if a person says to a twin, you're allowed to marry a woman that has a sister, no problem, and you say, Hariyat Mekudeshesli. Then you come and now you can't determine who you said it to. You can't take one because it may be the sister. It's not permitted. So you have a case of kedushin shelo nimsru levia. You can't cohabit with her because al pi halacha you can't. She can't be your wife. So again, it's an interesting case, but there's a machlokes in Abai and Rava. Rava somehow, I mean, I don't know the detail in front of me, but Rava says no, it's not from itself osir. Abai says for sure, you can't possibly have a consummate that marriage. And then so that's kuf. Then the gimel is giladata begito. In other words, you have a person who gives a get, and then the Gemara there brings down where he says other things that would negate the get. In other words, so he's hinting that the get was given improperly, so then maybe it's not a divorce. Oh, I didn't mean it, whatever. In other words, so there you have a havamina that's not a get, and therefore you have to be very careful because then she's an ashes ish. So according to Abaya Vadai, you have to give a second get. And according to Rava, you don't necessarily have to give a second get because, again, it wasn't clear that it was nullification of the get, so you don't have to. And then the final one is muma orchel nevelos lahachis. We say that that muma lahachis has to do with edus. So, in other words, whether or not a muma lahachis can be an aid. Possible the Indian aid is heaven. So again, Abaya is stringent and Rav is not. So this is very interesting because the Gemara tells us here. It's also brought in various other mesechtas that Yal Kagam the halacha is like Abaya, and Abaya is usually more stringent, and Rav is not. But anyway, in our case, we see the case of Yish that's the case. Okay. Let's just go a little bit further, see if we can finish this sugya. Rav Acha b'rei de Rava Rav Ashi. Rav Acha, the son of the very Rava we're talking about, said to Rav Ashi, Chim Acha the Esav Rava. Now that you have said the halacha is not like Rava, Hanatamra dezika hechachlinin. There was, in other words, there was a place where there were very strong winds and there were date trees. And it was common for the strong winds to rip the dates off the trees and they fell on the ground a foot away, 5 feet away, 10 feet away. The wind would blow and the dates would, if they're close to ripe, they would fall off and wouldn't necessarily fall right by the tree. They would fall further. Says the Gemara, in that case, What's the kasha? The kasha is, according to Rava Yir Shloimidas, we always said, have a years. So if he doesn't know that the wind is ripping off the dates and the dates are falling on the ground, he's meyayish, no problem. People come along on that road all the time and they pick up the dates and they eat them. How can anyone ever eat that date? If you say the halacha is like Abaya, that for sure, lo have a year, he doesn't even know that it fell, that the wind blew it, right? But how could you possibly say that? So what's shot in that Gemara where it says that Gemara, the dates that fall off, you're allowed to eat. How are you allowed to eat them? Mela, according to you said you can't eat them. But according to Rava, you can eat them. How can anybody say that you don't eat them? That's the Gemara's kasha. So Rava's son is saying to Ravashi, if my father is not correct, hey chachlinalu. So Ravashi answered him, Amalu kiva the ikishkatzim v'ramashim, since the streets, the roads are filled with insects and all kinds of vermin, the ka'achlu mi kara yish miyayish minay. So we're speaking in a situation where there were a lot of insects on the ground. So a person knew, you know what? If my dates are going to be blown off the tree, I am miyayish already now because no one is going to eat them. The insects are going to get into them right away. So the Gemara wants to say that particular case, that's the situation. It was a street infested or a road infested with shkotzim v'ramoshim, and therefore he would for sure give up. Okay, so that's how he wants to make his statement. Frank the Gemara, Yasme de la b'nei mechilin. So the Gemara always finds a kasha. The halacha is that a yosam, the orphan who is not yet bar mitzvah, has no independent ability to make something yish. In other words, if he's a boy who's not at bar mitzvah, a girl who's not yet 12 in a day, and if it's their parents control. But let's say they're a yosam, lav b'nei mechilin. So now he asks the kasha. So what happens with a yosam who can't be meichel? So forget about the fact that there are shikotzim v'ramashim. He can't be miyayish. He physically cannot. In other words, he can't even say what you and I will say is, forget about it. Their insects are there. I'm giving up even before I know if it blows off, because once it blows off, it's gone. We're saying a yosem can't even do that. So if a yosem can't do that, and there's a yosem who owns the ground, how can we allow someone to eat it anyway? Maybe it's a yosem's fruit. So the Gemara's kasha is, you want to make a general statement that wherever there is roads that are full of vermin, the owner says, forget about it, no havanim. But wait a minute, what happens if one of those trees belonged to a yosem and it blew off and it was vermin on the ground and he can't be miyayish? He physically can't be miyayish. So what are you going to do? Afrak the Gemara. Okay? So he says, Yasmid lav mechilinu. Okay, I'll grant you that some of the fields may have been Yisomim, but you're not going to tell me this is an entire stretch of ground. The bag is like a valley. You're not going to tell me the entire valley of hundreds of owners is mostly Yisomim. So yes, if there's one or two or three Yisomim, we're going to subsume them into the majority. And we're going to say it's okay, even though that they can't be Michael. But we go basa road, we go after the majority. So if the majority are people who are adults, and adults would for sure be miyayish if they knew that the road was full of insects, and this is what we're talking about. So in the middle of their sleep, they're miyayish because they know once that date falls on the ground, no one's eating it. I mean, and this is, by the way, people have a fetish. If it's something dry and they can pick it up, and they can wash it off. Oh, it fell on the ground. It's not so good for. Remember, we had the case of the squashed figs. So the squashed figs, Rava says for sure you're miyayish. But we're saying here that in the case of dates, Rava would also say that if you know whose date it is, you can't eat it. Even if I know for sure, Menashe, it was your field, your dates, and there are vermin on the ground, hefker. But I know it's yours. Terry says it's hefker. So, but What about Chas v'shalom? There's a Yosef living there. Okay, a Yosef is a minority. So we go after the majority, and we say that's why you're allowed to eat it. Frek the Gemara, muchzik v'omed. But what happens if for sure you know it was a Yosef? Okay, I understand. But what happens if you know that this field belonged to a Yosef? He can't be miyayish. The dates are on the ground. There's vermin on the ground, and we're stuck because he can't be miyayish. Even though 99% of the world would be miyayish, in that case, he can't be miyayish. How can you take his produce? That's the Gemara's kasha. And also the Gemara says, krachta mai, what happens if you have a field that has a stone wall all around it? That even if the dates flew off, they would still be in the property because they wouldn't fly onto the road because the wall would contain them. And for the Gemara, Omalei Asirin, now you got me. Okay, in that particular case, where there is no wiggle room, I agree with you that it's usher because there's just no other way that you can do it. But for the road, in the most of the instances where there's no wall or where you have the majority that are not Yisomim, the point being that if you know that something, if it falls, is going to be inedible, then you're already in your mind agreeing that it's miyayish. Abai wouldn't argue on that. That's not the machlokes. The machlokes is where something may or may not be usable. We hold like Abaya, yish shalom midas, lo have a yish. Yeah, Menashe.
What about, to take a different example that I know we've come up with in so many other places, it's not mentioned here. What happens if that tree, that little plowed land, somebody had given it to donate to the base of Mikdash? So it's hekdesh. So normally you couldn't take from that. It can only be used for kaddish purposes.
Right.
But you don't know walking around one tree, another tree, whatever. There's the rats running, scurrying along, etc. Is there, or maybe you do know whether it's a hekdesh one or not? Is there? Is if something's hekdesh, is there a miyayish type of a thing or no, or what?
No. So for hekdesh, no. If it's hekdesh, you can't be miyayish hekdesh.
Right. So I would therefore have to, so again, like with the orphan, just like if I knew that it was from an orphan's tree, I couldn't take, and if I knew that it was a hekdesh one, I couldn't take. But since most of the time it's not.
It's not hekdesh, should we go basarov? Exactly the point. So where if most of the fields, if a lot of the trees were hekdesh, then you have a problem. Because then you could say it could very well be a hekdesh tree. But if there's one farm that was magdish and the rest weren't, and we can reasonably say that these dates blew around, that you found it next to the hekdesh farm, but it's not unlikely that it blew from another farm. Again, you could be machmir, and you could say, you know what, Suffolk hekdesh, I'm going to go ahead and sell it, and maybe I'll use the money for hekdesh. But you don't have to, because we go basarov. But you're right. If we knew specifically it was hekdesh, then you could not. Now the question is different. If it fell from hekdesh and it's a road full of vermin, right? Then even hekdesh.
Right. That's my question. Can hekdesh be miyayish, and therefore would that be the same?
Okay. So your question is, can hekdesh? Yeah, but if you're magdish something and it's spoiled, then you can't eat it. You have to throw it away, unless. In other words, so what are you going to do with it? Let's say it's hekdesh. And it falls to the ground. Hekdesh can't be miyayish, but the road is full of vermin. What are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with that?
Right. So I presumably in general with these cases, presumably the idea is that since there's the rats running around or whatever, the normal owner of the tree would be miyayish, would assume if it fell on the ground, I'm not going to be able to get to it before a rat gets to whatever. So just I give up on the whole thing, miyayish. But somebody walking along, they saw, it looks like it's clean. It looks like it hasn't been bitten into, so it's probably fine. So I'll pick it up and I'll eat it. And so
the question is, does that road have a chazaka of having shrotzim? Now you have to know if this is, there are roads that everybody knows. These roads, there's no problem at all. There you have to scrutinize. You have to scrutinize again for something hekdesh. If there's enough of a yediyah, especially if you find it next to the hekdesh farm. There, I think you would go to the extra mile and say, I'm not just going to impute that it belongs to anybody else. I would say that it is hekdesh. But the truth is that when the Gemara says, let's take a look. When Rashi says here, Anatam Rizike Shaharuach Mashir, Hecha Cholulahu Holo Miyayish, Vahanokat Boya Ma'aka the Yusuf. Oh, so the Gemara Rashi has a different kasha. The Nakal Boya Ma'aka the Yusuf Rava, Kashadli, the below Yusuf Rava, Ikil Boya, the Homoida Rava, Beholdava, Shechuzoso, Machialov, Chutzme, Ta'ena, Mapnation, Miss in the philosopher. So in other words, the kasha is, why is it just a kasha on Rava? It should be a kasha across the board, because the only time Rava admits and says for sure is when it's a ta'ena. If it's a fig, then it's squash. Then Rava, of course, would say, and everybody would say that there's no way you can eat it, right? In other words, even a buyer who says that you can't, so he's saying that it's agavorcha. We want to make it. We want to say that it wouldn't be eaten. So mikara mikodim nifiloso yish miyayish. A person is miyayish even before it falls because he knows it's going to be eaten by the vermin or the rats. The yadua hu shaharuach masha mehem v'hashkotzim muzumonim laochlan. And the rats or the shvatzim, they're all over. And the minute, or the ants is a good example. Or the minute that piece of fruit falls down, the ants are all over it. You see it right away. Yisomei kitanim she'ein hafkirim hefker. They can't be mafkir. And to your point, the same would be true of hagdish. Ba'aro diyasmele machzekinen. Ein olenu lahachzik kol abika b'cheskes hakaka shel yisomim. We don't have to assume that the entire valley is full of fields belonging to Yisomim. V'la'asa kol Yisomim mishum sofik karka shel Yisomim. El holchen acha harov. Now, muchzik v'omed my karka asmo shel Yisomim. Okay. Krachta mai b'kolem hakruchim hamakufim begeder shel avonim soviv she'ein shkotzim ermoshim k'nisim. Like we said, there's no possibility. Then the Gemara says that for sure is awesome. Now, so to your question, Menashe, if it's hegdish and it blew off, and there are rats and vermin and ants all over the place, and you want to take it, I don't know what you're going to do with it, but you want to take it, then the Torah says you can't take it. In other words, I don't know what you want to use it for, but if you're asking hypothetically, can I take something that belongs to Hegdish, that I know is Hegdish, for certain, just like you know it belongs to the Yisomim, and you can't be Mafka Hegdish, just like a Yasim can't be Mafkir, the Gemara says, Osir. Now, what are you going to do with it? Okay, that's not even our issue. The Teretz is, in your case, it's Osir. You can't take it, you have to leave it there, and either someone else will, I don't know, maybe someone will sell it and give the money to Hagdish, or just remember, it's also Bahano. So you can't even have a gnaw from it. So let's say you weren't going to eat it, but you wanted to use it, let's say, for fuel. Let's say you want to take that date and maybe somehow you'll get some fuel out of it, which doesn't entail eating. That's also. Just like you can't take it from the Yosem because you can't make it Hefker. I guess the Gemara is telling us that the rule is the rule. A Yosem can't be Mafker, Hegdish can't be Mafker, even though we can't eat it, it's Osir, so it's also Bahano, also and everything else. So I think that's what he's getting at here, is that it's also Bahano. So in your case of Hegdish, you would not be able to use it because Ein Hefker Behegdish. So I think that's the proper answer. In any event, we've reached a natural point. The halacha is like a baya, and Yish Lo Midas is Lo Have a Yish. And so if you have a bad dream or something, and you think that you lost all your property, and in your dream you say, "Oh boy, I just lost a fortune." No worries, because once you wake up, now if you really lost the fortune, you have bigger trouble. But if you didn't, you can't say that was a bad dream, and luckily I wasn't miyayish, because yish doesn't help. You can't be miyayish. So that's the upshot. That's the upshot of the Gemara. The halacha is like a bayit.
Shkoyach.
Yishkaya.
Ah.
Shkoyach.